Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Teddy Downey, executive editor here at the Capital Forum. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Andy Fitch and Cynthia Hanawalt of Columbia Law School's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Andy is a climate and business law fellow at the Sabin Center, previously worked at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. Cynthia is director of climate and business law at the Sabin Center, and they are the authors of a recent study, From Tech to Table, Moving Sustainable Proteins Beyond Marketplace Bottlenecks. It's really interesting. I highly encourage everyone to read it. I learned a ton. And Andy, Cynthia, thank you so much for doing this today.
Happy to be here with you. Thanks for your interest.
So, for those of us who are not familiar, can you walk us through what are alternative proteins and how you became interested in this market?
Yeah. So the most basic way to think about this is that there are three categories that the industry itself usually identifies as alternative proteins. There are plant-based alternative proteins, and this is what you're probably most familiar with. This is a soy burger. Okay, these are products that are already in the marketplace, and basically everybody's familiar with them. You at least pass them in the grocery shelves, whether or not you buy them. There are fermented proteins. These are so the plant-based soy and pea protein are by far the biggest crops that are the basis for those. But there are a lot of alternative crops, and we can talk about this as concentration continues in the soy and the pea protein markets. You see a lot of startups trying to figure out other crops that they could work with. The fermented proteins would be the second category. These are derived from micro proteins, and please don't ask us about the science of this because you do not see us in a science lab, but we can get to a bit of it if it's useful. This is probably most used right now in vegan markets, often for dairy or egg substitutes. So I'm not a vegan. I was at a certain point in my life, and I remember the endless frustration of reading down a grocery ingredients or grocery products ingredients label, and then finding whey, WHEY, at the end, which would suggest there was some dairy. Why did my loaf of like kind of generic bread at the grocery store? Why did my Wonder Bread need to have dairy in it? I didn't understand this. And so a lot of the time, the fermented protein market is helping to allow for some sort of vegan alternative there. But it won't necessarily be a product that you can see. It's an ingredient in your products. And then cultivated or lab grown meat. And those phrases of how this is described kind of often say what side someone's on here. But cultivated meat is kind of the most generative, still formative. It does get sold very little in the world as a whole right now. But for cultivated meat, you take stem cells from an actual animal, and you mix them in this kind of sugar and proteins kind of magical combination. Everyone has their different kind of trade secret formula for it. And you grow what is presented as genetically equivalent protein to an animal. And so that would be the kind of most nascent stage of these alternative proteins. Cynthia, do you want to talk about interests, how we got there?
Yes, I have a quick question
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you mentioned cultivated and lab grown. So lab grown is like the pejorative version, and cultivated is like the nicer version. I did the
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. I still love, like, if you ever go into co-op and you see posters of Dr. Bonner. I don't know if you've ever seen those where he has on like the welder glasses and stuff, and he's manufacturing organic soap. I think lab grown sounds cool. But yeah, if you want to kind of make this the exotic, weird other that you never in your life want to try, you call it lab grown.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah. And so how did you two stumble upon this or find this as something you wanted to write about from a competition standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking at where antitrust and sustainability intersect for several years now at the Sabin Center. We think it's a really interesting field of research that we've been trying to help develop. And that work has gone in a bunch of different directions. Some of it bumps into the political arena, like the anti-ESG movement, taking aim at climate collaborations. We've published legal analysis trying to respond to those concerns. Some of our work, I guess, is more theoretical, thinking about, is there room in the consumer welfare analysis to expand the lens, beyond price to consider consumer preferences around climate. there's a huge body of law you've got to shape there. So that's not like a nimble strategy, which is where I think this project comes in. This paper is the first in like a sort of broader green innovation series we've just launched. And we're trying to identify nascent industries that we think are crucial to the climate transition, and might benefit from sort of antitrust intervention. And you don't need to think about sustainability exceptions or anything. This is relying on kind of traditional antitrust concerns and just inviting them into new spaces, right? Killer acquisitions, supply chain integration, patent thickets, all the stuff in this paper, those concerns aren't new. I think the contribution we're trying to make here is to spotlight where intervention in one of these early markets could be beneficial. And you don't have to accommodate climate goals in any particular way. It's just like, hey, look over here. These markets actually need some support to develop at the pace necessary to meet the moment on climate.
So I want to talk a little bit about the environmental and ethical reasons to do alternative proteins, because there's a problem that they're solving, right? And I would love it if you two can talk about that problem. What are the environmental and ethical benefits to having a thriving market here? And then also at the same time, if we can talk about how much of that problem could be solved by addressing a more competitive and ethical ecosystem around farming when it comes to plants and animals. Just a better competitive environment there seems like you could, and better rules, better ethical rules, better environmental rules. Seems like you could get a big amount of a solution that way. So I would love to hear from you both about that.
Yeah, for sure. I can start with the climate stuff. And we know, Teddy, that you have some qualms about alternative proteins. So we're happy to address those in whatever direction.
I'm a skeptic. I want to out myself as a skeptic here.
Yeah, if it's useful to know, my wife is a nutritionist, and I'll ask her late at night, "Can we go somewhere and try cultivated meat?" And she'll say, like, "I have a headache. Go away." So this sort of thing is happening across dinner tables, throughout the country, I believe, right now. But for us, I mean, so from the climate perspective, I'll address that part. So, it's better known in Europe, and people talk about this in North America as well, but agriculture is a significant contributor to global warming, to greenhouse gas emissions. And it's about a third of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are coming from agriculture right now. More than half of that, so we're talking about more than 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming specifically from animal agriculture. And methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas that obviously is coming out of a lot of cows. Okay, so that's actually 25 times more potent for a 100-year timeline as a greenhouse gas global warming contributor. And so that's where there are these real significant concerns for us. Also, there's a very live debate going on. How much will we actually reduce emissions if we transfer, from the fields to these labs? Do they become these new warehouses spewing out their own emissions? How can you say this is a clean technology, blah, blah, blah? But 40%, I think this is the most striking statistic, 40% of the Earth's habitable land is right now devoted to animal livestock. And so, if that whole 40% of the world were transferred to other uses, I'm sure some of it would go to, Grand Prix racing tracks, and there would be these new emission spikes that are very localized. But we have to assume that when we're talking about places like Brazilian rainforest being converted for animal agriculture, that there is significant potential to suck, this is called a carbon sink, to remove greenhouse gas emissions from the climate that is being lost, that's just being overlooked right now because of our default practices. Last thing I'll say, I'll let Cynthia address more kind of the antitrust questions if you want, and I can do that too. But in terms of ethics, this is a very live debate too. And so the one point I want to make with ethics is this has been a very fraught dynamic in cultivated meats because they still were derived from a very kind of horrific animal harvesting practice. Very recently, that technology has had significant breakthroughs as well, so that's no longer done. So I can explain that in more detail, but it used to be the case that harvesting even cultivated meat was going to cause significant use that you could consider deeply unethical if you wanted to of animals, and that is no longer the case. But anyway, Cynthia, I can go into the antitrust stuff, but I'm already blabbing about climate. So what do you think?
No, that was helpful. I think the one thing I would maybe add is that I'm not sure we see it as a choice, honestly, Teddy. Like it's not, do you want a robust alternative protein market, or should we actually pay more attention to the agriculture and sort of animal livestock production issues that arise with respect to competition? I think we would like to see both addressed. Alternative proteins, we're not coming to this as boosters of alternative proteins necessarily, but they obviously do have huge climate change mitigation value and other benefits around animal welfare and human health and food safety, pandemic issues coming up with antibiotic use. Like, I mean, there's a waterfall of social issues that this can touch on. So I think we're interested to see this become a robust market and are trying to kind of spotlight our concerns in nascent industry. You have sort of the opposite overly mature problems in agriculture and livestock that also could use real attention. One of the other areas that we're thinking about exploring, this project, I said, it's a series. We've got a dozen papers planned over the next, 12 to 18 months, hopefully, in lots of other sectors, but also in agriculture, thinking about, smart spraying technology or biogas digesters, things that also intersect with climate concerns and may or may not have problematic competition issues in them.
Yeah, and I would just add, in terms of these kind of secondary effects, many countries are now, and advocates in the US of alternative proteins are very much focusing on national security, food security issues. So we both have supply chain interruptions, and we have, for countries that are, there are a lot of emerging economies where populations are still growing exponentially or very quickly, and expectations for, what we would consider an average diet are also spreading throughout the world, as they, justifiably should. So for many countries, this is a basic, serving the needs of our people type of question. But also, as Cynthia was saying, the pandemic showed us that supply chains are, inherently fragile in a lot of these markets, and that having this kind of robust array of possibilities is not bad for anybody. There is a federal task force now devoted to competition concerns in the food sector that is offering this type of, we need to kind of shore up our supply chains and make sure that there is, ample access to these basic forms of sustenance of life. And so that's also in the background here.
I'm very curious about how big you think this market can get, and also like who are the big players, and what are the problems you really see in the market right now?
I can start on this one. So how big it can get, I do think this is a subjective question that I don't know if I can answer. When I comb the shelves right now, I'll admit it's not like my grocery cart is filling up with this stuff. Okay. So a lot of it seems like it's, I think a lot of it is, if you're in a family and you already are eating some processed foods because you need to put stuff out on the table for your kids, I don't think this is a huge step for you necessarily. If you are someone who feels like you're devoted to farm to table practices and sustainable farming, and you want to see the apple before it becomes the applesauce and hold it in your hand, then this is a leap. And there are also, of course, cost questions. These are still premium products. And at a time when, grocery prices are skyrocketing, in part due to consolidation. So there are all of those elements at play here. But in terms of your question, kind of who are the players, there are, the easiest way to start to talk about this is that there are innovative startup companies, and which are often tech-based companies, kind of low profile in terms of public recognition. And, if they're relying on venture capital, usually that there's been a huge cut in venture capital accessibility over the last several years for a lot of these smart startups. We could talk about that if you want. So there are the startups who have the tech. And then you have kind of traditional agriculture, often, the giant meat processors, for example, who are starting to invest more in and acquire a lot of these companies or their technologies. So you have, and moving into the space with their own products. So, JBS, world's largest beef processor, has invested significantly in three of the major plant-based firms in Europe over the last 5 years. I'm just sorry, two were plant-based and one was cultivated meat. So you see that sort of development happening too. You see suppliers like Cargill, which is one of the big suppliers for pea protein, for example, for Beyond Meat. They also have their own downstream brands now. And they're not necessarily called like Cargill burgers. It doesn't sound that appetizing, but they have their own brands. And so they are both the suppliers providing these pea protein commodities to their competitors, and then they are this brand name product that is competing with Beyond Meat at the same time. So there are some confusing issues there, but the biggest concerns for us are for startups, there's a lot of regulatory complexity. So can they kind of navigate this time when their access to capital is already diminishing in different ways? They have to prove themselves to investors. These are expensive technologies, and if we want to talk about this, there are a ton of new regulations and laws, state laws they face. So there's that group. There are the kind of dominant agricultural players who everyone on this call knows have been involved in a whole lot of lawsuits related to collusive coordinated effects practices in the last 10 years. And they're moving into this space, and they may be, and we could talk about this, trying to kill off some of these technologies, but they also may be just trying to diversify into this market and to do so at a pace that serves their bottom line. So, again, Cynthia and I are coming at this from a climate perspective. We need urgent growth in these fields because we urgently need to reduce emissions. These companies are thinking, maybe there'll be some people who just want the soy burgers down the road, and so we're going to stick with our legacy products, but we're also going to dabble in that stuff. So they're kind of this new pressure point in the marketplace. Anyway, I can hold off there, but those are actually the two. Those are the biggest ones to talk about here.
Okay, great. And you mentioned one of the problems, which is well, you mentioned several problems there, so would love to touch on that. Let's actually start with the VC access. I'm curious, how is VC access drying up for some of these companies?
So, I mean, the most immediate thing has been just a redirection of a lot of VC to AI over the last several years. And so there was a time where solving kind of a niche climate tech concern was maybe a bit more relevant for a lot of the venture capitalists who have these funds available. So that's the biggest pressure point here. And so you have companies like, the big meat producers, JBS, Tyson. They have capital. They have their own capital. They have their own revenue streams already out there. They can kind of endure this era when it is a little harder to find capital if you need it to develop these products. And so that is concerning for us, particularly for the possibility of killer acquisitions with an analogy to pharmaceutical sector, buying up a technology that hasn't yet been monetized. So maybe you can even purchase it for a price where you don't have to report it to antitrust regulators. And maybe, again, you kind of incorporate it into your own existing business, maybe, and kind of slowly shift what you're doing, or maybe you just let it sit on the shelf and wither and die. And there is, legacy of that and ongoing examples of that in the pharmaceutical industry that we point to through several different studies in the paper.
And what do you think? What's a good solution there? You mentioned HSR reportable transactions, maybe state, clearly not, you're not going to get any attention from the DOJ or FTC right now on this. I would imagine, just given their anti-ESG philosophy, they seem very committed to that, and just general laissez-faire attitude toward antitrust and monopoly beyond that. But the states have picked up a lot of slack. The states are interested in having more attention on these types of killer acquisitions that you're mentioning, spending more time with HSR, requiring their own HSR forms and things like and reporting. Is that one option for addressing this issue? And what are some other proposals? What do you think needs to happen to uh, stop the big meat producers from dominating this nascent market?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. Um, One, just as a frame, I'm not sure how political this is. Antitrust is appealingly more bipartisan than other dimensions of climate concerns. And you don't really have to come at this with a climate lens to care about the antitrust issues here, right? It's not necessarily about an emission strategy or climate strategy to be looking at some of these technologies and identifying where there might be sort of risks to competition that maybe even federal enforcers would care about. Certainly, we think this could get traction at the state level as well. But I guess the thing I want to acknowledge is that we're not sitting in the seat of an enforcer, right? And antitrust investigations are notoriously complex and fact specific. We're not trying to suggest with any certainty that enforcement action is warranted here. We're not coming to those conclusions. I think what we're saying is we see characteristics of these three markets that we think raise some questions, right? The incumbents, like Andy was mentioning, the sort of big meat processors exploiting their market dominance, or first movers acting aggressively to protect their turf, and feels like these merit some scrutiny.
Yeah, and Cynthia was getting at this earlier. Kind of the bigger project we have here is looking at a variety of different, what we would consider climate industries. And the question is the timing and pace of intervention, of antitrust intervention. Okay, so we tend to, and for good reason, defer often during formative technological moments to an industry to kind of sort itself out. And regulators don't feel like they have adequate information to intervene. Courts certainly are not going to feel comfortable intervening at that point and reshaping a market or anything like that. That's totally valid. But we do think that a conceptual vocabulary can start to be developed at an earlier stage in some of these clear technologies of our near-term future. And that concern especially comes for us out of seeing during the Biden administration admirable whole of government initiatives, both in terms of competition and in terms of climate, that were not effectively harmonized, so that they ended up being kind of half of government, or two steps forward, two steps back. Unfortunately, in some circumstances where you could be, Tesla had a monopoly, I would say. Again, this is kind of informal. I'm not saying this as an enforcer, but Tesla in the early 2020s had more than 50% share of EV charging in the US, of EV sales in the US. It excluded non-Tesla brands from using its charging network. And it was maybe engaging in something like product tying. Like if you wanted to buy an EV in the US, it was really hard not to buy this premium Tesla product with self-driving capacity. Okay, that was all going on. We were also, devising subsidies for EVs that were going to kind of help reinforce Tesla's dominance in that field space. And there was some pushback. There was a little bit of pushback to get Tesla to open up its network, but nowhere near the extent that we see in a country like Norway. So anyway, that's a huge diversion to the EV market. But the point is, we just want to see in the future. Let's say we are a little wary of Trump administration taking this topic on directly, because we don't know if Trump will say like, it's invasion of the body snatchers all over again. It's just something that makes no sense, but it becomes the logic for enforcement for the next 3 years. So we're kind of worried about that part. But when people on both sides of the political aisle start thinking about technologies of the future that we kind of know are going to be shaping our future, and that other countries are very actively thinking of coherent industrial policy, maybe we want it, maybe we don't, about, we just want there to be greater harmony in thinking through, this is the sector to look at. Maybe we're not going to enforce right away there, but let's get to know that sector. Let's break down its conceptual categories. Let's see where the pressure points are, and then let's monitor it, especially for M&A at this point. A lot of this is just not letting some sort of dominant power solidify before it can be addressed.
Is a lot of the market that for this product in California, just because like not because the California is like the lefty state, but like that's what I think of when I think of the Soylents and VCs and food innovation and some biotech. I mean, obviously there's biotech in Boston, but would this be an interesting issue for California? I'm asking this because I really see zero chance of the DOJ or FTC. Like I mean, as close to zero as I could possibly put it for you. Look, spending resources on it. They don't have any resources. They're not doing much with them anyway. I mean, and we can get to a market that's tangentially related in a second that they are looking into. But would this, where are the sales of this stuff and where is it popular and like which state might be interested, I guess is kind of what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, so it's definitely not selling a lot in Texas because my reading of Texas state law is that you could go to jail for a year right now if you sell a cultivated chicken patty. So it's complicated in a lot of ways. So basically, again, we're talking about technologies to some extent of the future. Okay, but using this analogy, when I was bringing up the EVs, it's like using this analogy of well now, like China has figured out low cost EVs that are like basically if we didn't have tariffs would be like dominant in our country too, and they're going to be doing that with this other stuff. So that's kind of the background concern for us here with how this is all playing out. I'm sorry, what was your question again? I just had to ramble for a second
It
about.
was states that might act that
Oh
where
yeah,
consumers are buying
scale.
this stuff, where it's picking up traction, the grocery
Yeah,
store, that type of thing.
yeah, sales, right? Okay, so they're truly so it's complicated. There are really at any given time in the last year or two when I've been monitoring, there are maybe literally one or two restaurants in the country that may be offering one product. Okay, that's how emergent of a market. When we're talking about cultivated meats, that's cultivated meats. Okay, again, plant-based. We all know plant-based is just kind of part of American dietary possibility, at least, right? Can't you go to McDonald's and get a Impossible Burger at this stage? So that's already out there. Again, the fermented proteins are kind of out there and less conspicuous to people because they serve a niche, and that niche is like into them. And so it sounds. I'm guessing you're asking more about the cultivated meats part of this.
Or just in general, I mean, you've got antitrust issues in all three. I just which state is the most likely? Which state AG? Look, you've got state AGs on this call right now, right? Like, you've got state AGs listening to this. Which of them do you think should be poking around here?
I can speak unless you want to, Cynthia. Okay. I mean, this is one thing I will say. I'm not looking at the chat. Okay, so I don't know who's on the call here. Okay. I mean, what we'd really love to see is to not have this become a big partisan issue because there are very genuine just transition concerns here too, and there has been a ton of pushback at the state legislative level already, and it happens to be primarily in what we would consider agriculture intensive states. I think part of that, and it has to do, we can get into the details of this. Part of it is about labeling, food labeling, which again seems totally valid. Like you should know what you're eating, right? Part of it has to do with states banning sales, like I was saying, or banning research or funds, access to research funds or something like that to these products. And we understand that, again, the national meat industry is not opposed is not opposed to legalizing cultivated meats. They are actually often quietly quietly resisting these efforts to make these products illegal. And what we're seeing there again is that these companies are going to be able to diversify, and they are going to be able to kind of survive this transition. There are a whole bunch of kind of small scale animal livestock producers in the US, 600,000 plus of them, and it's going to be harder for them. There's no doubt. There are again other countries, we could talk about this, have proactive policies to be dealing with this just transition right now already embedded, and that's things like developing fostering development of cultivated meat facilities in agricultural communities, developing technology for new cultivated or alternative protein related side stream products. What are the other products that are necessary for these alternative proteins to come to market? What sorts of supplies are necessary for that? What else could farmers be growing instead? This is being sorted out in any number of countries. I feel like it's just sort of a issue in the US right now, and it should be more proactively addressed. And I will say that the people most proactively addressing a lot of these questions, I'd say, are the Good Food Institute, if viewers are not familiar with them, as a credible source that is trying to both inform the public and encourage open access research. That means that a lot of the stuff doesn't become kind of patent protected and siloed, and probably the domain of big agriculture as you know it today. So in terms of states, there are these, or in terms of which state should be doing something. To be honest, I'd say whoever can come up with an effective strategy so that you're not just building a blue state coalition and saying this is the tech future and agriculture is bad for the environment, and so let's have our good team win over the bad team. That's not the approach I'd be looking for here. I'd be looking for how can we effectively figure out a transition in which everyone is going to be, you don't have to buy the products, but where we're not going to see a state level patchwork of laws that just kind of, again, both stifle the growth of this market and make it so that only the big incumbents can survive all of the regulatory complexities they face and all of the uncertainty about when their products can go to market and things like that. So from a competitive standpoint, especially, I think the best thing to do is to foster a political climate that would allow for these like punitive regulations to become obsolete. I don't know, Cynthia, if you have, or I mean, I'll let you.
One thing in the Cynthia, anything you want to jump in or?
I mean, the one thing I guess I would pick up on two things that Andy was sort of nodding to. One is just the tremendous regulatory complexity that exists right now, sort of stemming from inconsistent state laws, and the way in which that fundamentally favors, a small handful of firms that can then navigate those political and regulatory hurdles, right? Just as incumbents, and more sophistication and more resources. I think the other point around timing, I think, is really important when you're thinking about enforcement. If you are, the bureau chief of a, antitrust division in some AG's office, right? Like you have a team of 15 lawyers, right? Big tech is like the high profile target right now, right? Like all of antitrust reinvigoration has been around sort of anti-monopoly work in the last number of years, which is incredibly important and also incredibly resource intensive. And I think it is a novel idea to suggest that you should be intervening much earlier at these sort of nascent stages of markets. I think there's room there, and I think there are blueprints for it in other jurisdictions, right? In Europe and in in the UK, you've seen competition policymakers, sometimes they'll include sustainability considerations into their enforcement agenda, which I don't think we have an appetite for in the US, even at the state level. I think there's an expectation that like social benefits flow from competitive marketplaces, which I certainly buy. I agree with that fundamentally. But I think intervention earlier in a market's development can be aligned with those goals.
One thing you mentioned in the paper is that startups to be successful in this space need access to contract manufacturing infrastructure. What are other countries doing to provide that type of infrastructure, and why is that important?
Yeah, so the question here about why it's important has to do with this so-called valley of death scenario, where you have a startup that is trying to appeal to funders. It has what is already a pretty expensive technology it's developing, but it also needs to have ongoing testing of that product to like fine tune it, to have demonstrable success with it. And so for that, you need a lot of lab infrastructure that is very expensive itself, and that is it's kind of in between. It's too expensive of work for a university research lab to do often, but it's not guaranteed enough to lead to successful outcomes to justify developing your own infrastructure for this. So a lot of startup firms are relying on contract manufacturing operations, CMOs, and they will where they can basically rent the space for use in this way. There's relatively scarce opportunity to do that in the US. I can't give you a precise number, but I know that advocates in the alternative protein industry have been celebrating for a year the opening of one single alternative protein conducive CMO in Janesville, Wisconsin, as transformational. So that gives you a sense that there aren't a whole lot of them out there. Okay, this is anecdotal, but that gives me a sense that there aren't a lot of them out there. And so again, there are any number of different kind of opaque contractual elements here. Who gets access to that one space? How much do they get charged? Is it a fair market price, or can someone just gouge them because there's no other opportunity out there? Hard to say. In terms of your question, what other countries are doing, so just within the last year, the Netherlands, Canada, and China all have opened publicly, sponsored or owned infrastructure of this sort, specifically targeting alternative proteins because they see this as a market of the future that they want to be thriving in. And so that's kind of the most basic example of what can be done here is kind of, publicly funded infrastructure accessibility.
That seems super interesting. And as a way to not have to have these companies sell out or worry about their VC money drying up, just a lot more opportunity to actually be successful as a startup. I'm a small business. I appreciate that opportunity there. Now, you also write about the inputs into these products, some of these products at least, being soy and pea proteins, and those markets already being very consolidated. What is that? Is it just a cost issue, or what's the biggest problem there? And how big of a benefit would it be if those markets were opened up to more competition?
Yeah, and first of all, credit to you again to always go back to that question of is what we need kind of robust competition throughout the U.S. economy, and the answer is yes. Like we're working on a paper on this right now. Again, a little bit of a tangent, but on cool roofs. So this is like roofs that are good for kind of not absorbing too much heat, and then being efficient, energy efficient from an HVAC perspective. But the truth is, you have to deal with like roofing manufacturers, roofing distributors, roofing contractors who actually lay this stuff out there, roofing maintenance people. And all of those are potential bottlenecks, and they have like certification programs, and maybe the manufacturer only will deal with, certain distributors. Actually, the distributors are the most concentrated attorneys general out there, if you want to know. But yeah, this is another scenario where there are an infinitude of bottlenecks. Okay. And that's kind of one of the main concerns we had when we were starting to think through this project. If you look, for example, at a lot of the advocates of alternative proteins, when these big players come into the market, they get excited and they think, awesome, JBS is in here, we're for real, So it's like validating for them. But for us, and there's no doubt that with a lot of these costs that are out there, the need for mature companies to enter these markets is present. It certainly helps the products actually make it all the way to consumers. Sometimes. But so the question is just, it shouldn't be a default assumption that when the big players come into these markets, they're going to make the market better. It's a possibility. Certainly, sometimes that'll help, but it won't always be the case. So that is a concern for us as well in terms of kind of how this consolidation can happen. Let's see, your question, though, was about the suppliers of commodities. Can you?
Yeah. There's so much going on here, but yeah,
Yeah.
I do want to, I just want to ask, like, how big of a problem is the high
Oh,
input costs and the
yeah,
consolidation in
yeah,
the
yeah.
soy
Okay.
and protein market? We've written a lot, and actually, these are areas that we just wrote an article. A dozen states are investigating, or 2 dozen states are investigating the seed market.
Yeah.
So, and soy is super consolidated. I don't, to be honest, I wasn't aware that pea protein was also consolidated. You mentioned that in the paper. I'm curious about that. But is it just I guess my question was, is it just the input cost there that is harming uh, the startups in this space that rely on that, or and what would the benefit of lower costs there be?
Yeah, so there is a useful European Parliament study came out in the last 2 years showing that there are supply chain concerns within this market, just in terms of there not being these markets have grown pretty fast. So there's an inadequacy of supply combined with an opacity of pricing and of kind of what seems like exclusivity scenarios playing out in terms of who has access to these commodity supplies coming from the upstream suppliers or not. So that's like the basis of our concerns here, combined with that idea that these are sometimes these pea protein suppliers are or soy suppliers are also then competing with their own products further downstream. So we make the analogy people like to make, right, to 19th century scenarios where you have a conglomerate that owns a railroad, but they also may be owning perishable food products that are delivered on that railroad network, and their competitors are trying to deliver on that network too. Who's going to get their products to the refrigerator in Chicago faster so they don't spoil? It's a somewhat analogous scenario here where someone's operating quite far upstream in a market that has scarcity concerns already, opacity concerns in terms of contractual provisions, and then downstream is competing.
Cynthia?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it's a distribution problem as much as it's a cost problem. But I think it's also like a translation issue, right? To understand what is even the pea protein landscape, right? Like this is all sort of unfamiliar turf. Like part of why we are trying to look at these industries is to try and help maybe make them a little bit more legible to players in the antitrust space, right? Fermentation is just like beer and wine and yogurt and cheese, right? Like that is legible to us on one level, and then also like terribly confusing when you think about like biomass fermentation and how these little microorganisms are turning into proteins. And so I think that is off-putting and inaccessible in a way that makes it harder to police.
You discuss weaponization of IP as a problem in this space. Can you give some examples of that and what needs to be done about that so that that's not a concern?
Yeah. So we use again, a lot of our analogies are to the pharma industry here for a couple of reasons. One of the main ones being that it's like a biotech scenario. You're dealing with biological elements and tech elements. And has its own complications in the US patent system where things have to be, new, novel, and non-obvious. It's a little more complicated to make those sorts of claims when you're talking about biological products to begin with. We are particularly interested in watching legal counsel provide advice to the alternative proteins industry to emulate the practice of cultivating patent thickets in the pharma sector, in which you have you maybe have your kind of breakthrough technology that is patentable in a legitimate way, but then you also patent any number of different subcomponents in alternative protein spaces. This would be like texture enhancers, flavor enhancers, things like this, so that you're just kind of making litigation risk all-consuming for anyone who may have a somewhat similar product to yours. You're just offering so many different possibilities for some sort of infringement claim to be made against you. And there are certain players, again, we're not saying that they should go to jail, but Impossible Foods, by far, in terms of IP in the alternative protein sector, has filed for the most patents. They filed for over 300. Their nearest competitor has filed for about 100. Nearest competitor, I just mean someone else in this sector. They're not even. It's someone in the fermented side. But so Impossible has been very proactive in its filing. Again, we're talking about small firms. And so litigation risk really could, just make it impossible to stay viable. So there was a challenge brought against one of Impossible's pretty significant patents for its heme protein, HEME for the transcription here, heme protein. And ultimately, it was determined that this was not a valid patent that Impossible Foods held. However, the case settled. Impossible ended up buying the competing product from the competing project from the firm that was challenging it, and that firm went under. I think it was that week. So this would be a scenario where just having the resources to withstand this sort of legal challenge in an IP space may make you invincible in a field where your competitors might have better products, but they just don't have the capital resources to sustain that sort of legal challenge.
Cynthia, any thoughts? No.
I'm not sure there's much to add. I mean, I think pharma is the obvious analog here, and anytime you see that strategy being advocated by defense lawyers, that makes me nervous.
There is.
Right,
Oh,
yeah.
go ahead, Ted.
I was gonna say rightfully so, but yeah, jump in, Annie.
Just, there's the example of the Orange Book that the FTC has developed in terms of looking at potentially anti-competitive patents and kind of making it known to firms that are engaging in this sort of practice that you are being observed in doing it. Again, under this current administration and how they could weaponize things, I'm not like calling up someone at DOJ and saying, hey, this is a real cool climate tech space for you to check out right now or anything like that. But it'd be great if, in general, enforcers were adopting some of those tools for as the alternative protein sector grows. And we're saying, like, we want this sector to develop. Patents are essential for, allowing firms to commit the resources they need for this R&D intensive product development. But let's make sure that they don't kind of prevent others from developing their own products and competing.
I'd love to move on to listener questions. We don't have any yet. If you have a question, please put it in the questions panel, put it in the chat. We would love to address any questions the audience has here, our listeners have. One thing I've been thinking as you two have been talking is that the monopolists here are the same meat packers that are often alleged to be colluding in their own market. And here we have them acquiring potential substitutes. So like another way ostensibly to collude, to control supply, they can turn, you said they could sit on the innovation if they want, they could do nothing, how big of a problem? I mean, is this almost part of the same problem that antitrust enforcers are already looking into? There are already federal and state investigations into the meat packers. I mean, meat packing consolidation has been an issue forever, it seems like. How do you think of this just being intertwined in that bit, already identified problem? Cynthia?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think thematically it makes a lot of sense, right? That these are the same players that are seemingly exercising the same types of behaviors that are problematic. I think when you come to like actual legal action, it's really different. And the way in which the consolidation manifests in the sort of meatpacking industry is classic monopoly behavior, right? And should be interrogated for sure. The way in which those players are acting on lab-grown proteins, for example, is really different. It's more analogous to like the fossil fuel companies buying up startups or battery technology IPs and then like shelving all of that innovation, right? So I think the antitrust lens that you need to bring to bear and the market analysis that you need to do is actually really different and might lead you to different outcomes. So I don't know that it gets wrapped up, honestly, in the same set of investigations. Maybe it's sort of useful education, right? Like when I was in practice, like it takes a few months to just learn an industry, right? And get up to speed on who the players are. And that is probably going to contribute to like more effective policymaking here. But I think it needs to be its own set of work, honestly, for it to be effective in this space.
It was more like Google got sued both for search and ad tech, right? They're two different markets, but monopolists in both.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah.
Yeah, and as a think tank, we're interested in what scholars can do here. Again, what advocates can do in this space. We don't solely focus on enforcers, in part because this is such a nascent industry. So European Commission, in terms of looking at killer acquisitions in pharma, the European Commission retrospectively looked at, I think, something like 6,000 acquisitions in pharmaceutical sector, in which there was some sort of overlapping portfolio of drug products between the two firms, and then just statistically analyzed for what are reasons this acquired product did not make it to market, and found that, a statistically significant percentage of them, you can't come up with an explanation aside from the fact that this was a killer acquisition. That type of research would be great to see happening in this space as well. Some young, enterprising antitrust lawyer professor to make, his career out of, minutely following the alternative protein sector in detail. Please do so. We invite it. Good Food Institute has acquired its own stem cell lines, which have been historically very expensive. These are the basis for cultivated meat. And now they are an open access material that firms can, make use of. Good Food Institute funds a lot of research in this space, academic research that makes for, is it called prior art, I believe, in patent law, so that a product would not necessarily be new or non-obvious because the research for it has already been publicly disseminated. So those are the types of things. So there are a broad range of interventions here. When we're talking about enforcement, we understand enforcement is, most likely to happen at a later stage. We are just trying to set kind of the conceptual groundwork for it, and hoping, to some extent, and hoping for all of these other players to be doing their part as well.
You mentioned there are all these patchwork regulations at the state level, efforts, in Texas and other states to call it lab-grown meat or do ban cultivated meat, just attack this whole sector unilaterally. Who is paying for that? Have you guys looked into where is that coming from? I mean, if JBS is also doing it, why would, something, I'm curious who's doing that, who's this animated to try to keep it from even having some research and productization. It seems like such a niche market right now. What is the existential threat of having some vegan protein on the shelf or whatever? So I'm just curious how that came to be, and if you've looked into that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we've looked at actually who's funding these efforts to that degree. Somewhat you can tell, but it doesn't align necessarily with the sort of entrenched interests or political alignment that you might think. It is not necessarily the case that like the big meat packers are the ones trying to ban lab-grown proteins. There is a sort of health dimension and a sort of product safety, consumer welfare dimension to all of this that actually invites blue states in sometime to the regulation in unexpected or, constraining ways that are not necessarily wrong, but add complexity as well. And there are I think Andy was pointing to this earlier, the sort of just transition concerns. Like there are labor concerns here and sort of broader stakeholders involved that I think are playing into the way in which regulatory complexity is evolving at the state level.
Yeah, I'm sure we've all on this call had that moment where you think, oh, I bet there's a model law. I bet the usual suspects who develop all of the model laws wrote this law, and then you go Google search it and you've got them. We haven't had that moment that we've looked for that sort of thing. It does seem again that a lot of this, as Cynthia is saying, there are legitimate grievances here, or legitimate anxieties, let's say. Okay, so when I said there are 600,000 plus animal, I don't want to say animal farms, that's too Orwellian, but you get the idea here. In the US right now, I think that number is down by something like 40%, or the number of workers in this sector. There are very legitimate labor market questions here, and that was one thing that kind of first made this an interesting topic for us. Was we may have our climate values, but let's consider labor market values as well here, because this is a classic case where we're shifting work from like a human economy to a tech economy, or scale, whatever you want to call it. And unfortunately, the agricultural producers who seem maybe most threatened here are sustainable farmers. something like an organic producer of some sort who right now has people willing to pay for their premium product and knows that it's going to cost a little bit more if they treat their animals better. Those are the people maybe for whom a substitute product here is going to be the most challenging. So we're very much aware of all of that and want to acknowledge those are legitimate concerns that if we don't, this is where like to have a climate policy that's not looking at the labor market dynamics, that just doesn't work. We've learned that, right? The hard way. I will say too that blue states have enforced on some of these topics. Cynthia brought up, first of all, there are health concerns. There's like the MAHA side of things, but also California has, taken certain steps against certain food additives. So there are questions of, why couldn't there be this greater regulation at the state level of our food supply? But also California has enforced on labeling concerns before in terms of, I think it was a vegan product that, you could reasonably perceive from the marketing confusion over whether or not this was a vegan product. And California has enforced on that. So again, this is not like the evil red states are against climate provisions alone. I don't know if there's someone out there who's against climate provisions, maybe, but it's not a question of red state versus blue state or good or bad really here. There's a complicated array of concerns that we're trying to address.
Well, again, the paper was excellent. I enjoyed reading it. I'm super excited to see what you both produce in your upcoming. You said you have a dozen reports coming out on climate and competition. I'm looking forward to that.
I got stressed when Cynthia said that.
And so yeah, I just want to thank you so much for doing this today. It's been a pleasure.
Real
Thank you
pleasure
for
talking
having us.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for joining us on the call. We'll have the podcast out soon, and you've already heard it here, so you probably don't want to listen to it again. But we also have our TCF Investigates podcast, our other Second Request podcast. Please check them out. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. This concludes the call. Bye-bye.